The dust was the first thing she noticed, and the last thing she forgot. It coated the road, the sagebrush, and her own bare feet in a fine, pale powder, the color of bone. She sat with her back against a sun-bleached fence post, a small, still figure in a landscape built for giants. Her dress, a sack of light brown cotton worn thin as a prayer, was her only possession, and at 18 years of age, Leanne was utterly alone. Her stepmother's final words, a torrent of angry Cantonese, had been like stones thrown at her back as she was pushed from the door of the small shack behind the laundry in Rock Creek. Now there was only the vast, indifferent Wyoming sky and the shimmering heat rising from the dirt track. A horse's rhythm broke the silence. It was a slow, tired sound, the steady clop of hooves belonging to a rider who had been in the saddle since dawn. Silas Blackwood saw her from 100 yards out, a smudge of brown against the gray-green plains. His first thought was trouble. A lone woman on the road was always trouble, either a lure for it or a victim of it. He was a man who preferred to ride wide of both. He was heading back to his small homestead, a piece of land he'd carved out with his own 2 hands, and his mind was on his thirsty cattle and the fence that needed mending, not on stray souls. He drew nearer, his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil, flicking its ears. He could see her more clearly now. Chinese, young, barefoot. Her head was bowed, her long black hair a dark curtain hiding her face. She looked less like a threat and more like a sparrow that had fallen from a great height. He was set to ride on by, to tip his hat in a gesture that was more habit than courtesy, and leave her to her fate. It was not his business. The world was full of sorrows that were not his to carry. But as he passed, she looked up. And that was the moment everything changed. It wasn't her youth or her evident poverty that stopped him. It was her eyes. They were dark and deep, and in them he didn't see fear or pleading, but a shocking, bottomless exhaustion. The look of someone who had been holding on for so long they had forgotten what it felt like not to be falling. And beneath that exhaustion, a flicker of something else. A stubborn ember of will that had not yet been extinguished. In that one look he saw not a problem to be avoided, but a person, as real and weary as himself. Silas pulled back on the reins. Dust Devil grunted in protest. The silence stretched, thick with heat and the buzz of horseflies. Leanne flinched, expecting the rider to spur his horse on, or worse, to shout at her. But he just sat there, a tall man weathered by the sun, his face shadowed by the brim of a dusty hat. "You all right, miss?" His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. She scrambled to her feet, bowing her head again, a gesture of ingrained deference. She had to try. It was her last chance. She gathered the few English words she knew, words learned from railroad foremen and merchants' wives. "Work," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "Please, I can work." She held out her hands, palms up. They were small but calloused from years of scrubbing laundry and tending gardens. "Cook, clean, mend, anything. I am strong." Silas looked from her hands to her face. She was little more than a girl, and so thin a stiff wind might carry her off. The nearest town was another 10 miles, and a town was no safe place for her. He thought of his cabin, quiet and empty. He thought of the endless chores, the solitary meals. He had come out west to be left alone, but the silence he'd sought had lately begun to feel a lot like loneliness. He let out a long breath, the sound of a man arguing with his own better judgment and losing. "I ain't got much to pay," he said, more to himself than to her. "Hope. A feeling so foreign it was painful surged through her. "No pay," she said quickly. "Just a place. Food." He looked down the long, empty road behind her, then at the endless expanse ahead. Leaving her here was a death sentence, one way or another. He had seen what happened to the vulnerable in this country. He might be a man who valued his solitude, but he wasn't a man who could ride away from this. "Can you ride?" he asked. She shook her head. He sighed again, a deeper, more final sound this time. He swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted, his boots sinking into the thick dust. He stood a full head taller than her. He gestured to the horse. "Up you get," he said, his voice gruff to hide the knot of uncertainty in his gut. "We'll go slow." He cupped his hands for her foot. It was small, bruised, and covered in dust, but surprisingly strong. As he lifted her into the saddle, he felt her lack of weight, the fragility of her frame. She settled awkwardly in front of him, her body rigid, unsure of where to hold on. "Just grab the horn," he instructed, swinging himself up behind her. He gathered the reins, acutely aware of the small space between them. He could feel the warmth of her through her thin dress, smell the faint, clean scent of soap that clung to her despite her travels. He nudged Dust Devil into a slow walk. He did not yet know that the woman in his saddle was not the only thing he was bringing home. He was also bringing a fight, and it was coming for him, whether he was ready or not. The first week passed in a quiet, careful rhythm. Leanne was a tireless worker, moving through the small two-room cabin with a silent efficiency that astounded Silas. She cleaned corners he hadn't realized were dirty, mended shirts he'd long given up on, and coaxed a surprising variety of meals from his meager stores of flour, beans, and salted pork. She spoke little, and he, a man of few words himself, found the shared silence comfortable. He would work the land from sun up to sundown, and when he came in, tired and sore, the cabin would be clean, a warm meal waiting on the table, and a pot of coffee on the stove. He learned things about her, not from words, but from actions. He learned she was clever when he saw how she'd rigged a line to dry herbs she'd found growing near the creek. He learned she was gentle from the way she spoke in a low murmur to the chickens, who had never been so productive. And he learned she was proud when he tried to offer her the spare room, and she insisted on sleeping on a pallet by the hearth, refusing to take his bed. But their quiet world could not remain an island. His homestead was 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, but news in the territory traveled on the wind. On his next trip into town for supplies, the trouble he had anticipated was waiting for him. It took the form of Bartholomew Finch. Finch was a rancher who owned most of the valley, a man whose ambition was as vast as the land he coveted. He had been trying to buy Silas's quarter section for a year, wanting the creek that ran through it. Silas's refusal had been a constant stone in Finch's shoe. Silas was loading sacks of flour into his wagon when Finch approached, flanked by 2 of his hard-faced ranch hands. Finch was a large man, dressed in a tailored coat that looked out of place in the dusty street. He smiled, but it never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Good to see you. Heard you've taken on some help." Silas didn't stop his work. "Heard you spend too much time listening to gossip, Finch." Finch's smile tightened. "Gossip is the lifeblood of a community. It tells us who our neighbors are. And folks are saying you've brought a peculiar sort of stray onto your land. A Chinese girl." He said the words as if they were an accusation. The street had gone quiet. People stopped to watch. Silas straightened up slowly, his hands resting on the edge of the wagon bed. "What I do on my land is my business." "Is it?" Finch took a step closer. "This is a decent, God-fearing territory, Blackwood. We have standards. We don't take kindly to men who harbor foreign women of questionable character. It reflects poorly on all of us." One of Finch's men snickered. "Maybe you just got lonely out there." Anger, hot and sharp, coiled in Silas's gut. He was about to step forward when a small voice cut through the tension. "He is a good man." All eyes turned. Leanne stood by the entrance of the general store, a small basket of eggs in her hands. She had followed him into town, wanting to see it, and had been inside when Finch arrived. Now she stood there, small and seemingly fragile, yet her chin was high and her gaze was fixed squarely on Finch. Finch looked her up and down with open contempt. "And what would you know about good men?" "I know he gave me work when I had nothing," she said, her English careful and clear. "He gave me shelter. He is honorable." The directness of her defense stunned the onlookers, and Silas himself. He had only ever seen her as quiet and deferential. To see her stand up to a man like Finch in front of the whole town was a revelation. Finch laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Honorable? Or just foolish? This land has rules, girl. You'd do well to learn them." He turned his attention back to Silas, his voice dropping to a low threat. "A man's got to be careful what he brings onto his property, Blackwood. Sometimes things get lost. Or burn." He held Silas's gaze for a long moment, a clear promise of violence in his eyes, before turning and walking away, his men following like shadows. The crowd dispersed, muttering amongst themselves. The confrontation was over, but the air remained thick with menace. Silas went to Leanne. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her eyes were steady. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "He spoke lies about you," she answered simply. "I could not be silent." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the tattered dress and the weary traveler. He saw the steel that had kept her alive, the unbending core of her that had just faced down the most powerful man in the valley. He had offered her shelter, thinking he was protecting her. He was just beginning to understand that she might be the one with the greater strength. He knew then that Finch's threat was not an empty one. The fight for his small piece of land had just become a fight for her as well. The ride back to the homestead was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. The easy quiet had been replaced by a heavy, shared awareness of the danger Finch represented. The threat lingered in the air like the dust kicked up by the wagon wheels. That evening, after a meal eaten with few words, Silas found Leanne sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the landscape as the sun bled color across the horizon. The anger from town had settled into a cold knot in his stomach. He had brought this on her. He sat on the step above her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I'm sorry for what happened in town," he said. "Finch is a man who likes to make trouble, especially for me." She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It is not you who should be sorry. It is him. He is a man with a bitter heart." "He wants my land. He's wanted it for a year now. That creek is the only reliable water for miles." "And you will not sell," she stated. It wasn't a question. "No," Silas said. "My father worked himself into an early grave for a company that owned him body and soul. I swore I'd never work for another man. This land, this is the only thing that's truly mine." He paused, the admission costing him something. "It's all I have." She finally turned to look at him. In the fading light, her face was soft, her expression serious. "My father said the same thing. Not about land, about his name." She reached into a small pocket sewn into the inside of her dress and pulled out a small object. She held it out on her palm. It was a bird, intricately carved from a light-colored wood, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. "He worked on the railroad," she said, her voice quiet. "He came from our village, with many men. He said they would build a great iron dragon across a new country and earn enough to bring my mother and me over. He sent letters. And he sent this." He carved it on the long nights. He said it was a swallow because they always find their way home. Her voice faltered for a moment. My mother grew sick. The money he sent was not enough. When she died, my father sent for me to live with his brother in California. But my uncle had also died. There was only his wife, my stepmother. She did not want another mouth to feed. She traced the delicate lines of the carving with her finger. My father fell from a trestle bridge last spring. They buried him where he fell. He never came home. This is all I have left of him. Silas looked at the small wooden bird, then at her face. He finally understood the exhaustion he had first seen in her eyes. It was grief. A grief so profound she had carried it halfway across the country on foot. He had seen her as a problem to be solved, a responsibility he had reluctantly taken on. Now he saw her as a person, with a history as deep and painful as his own. Something inside his chest, a tight, guarded thing he had protected for years, began to loosen. He would be proud of you, Silas said, the words feeling clumsy but necessary. You're a survivor, Leanne. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I am just tired of surviving. I would like to live. The honesty of her words struck him like a physical blow. That was what he had been doing too, surviving, holding on to his land, keeping the world at bay, but not truly living. The next 2 weeks were a tense truce. There was no sign of Finch, but his presence was a constant shadow. Then, one morning, Silas went to check the creek and found the reason for the silence. Upstream, on the edge of his property line, a crude but effective dam of rocks and logs had been built, diverting the flow of the water onto Finch's land. The creek bed on his side was already turning to mud. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation. Without water, his cattle would die, his garden would wither, and he would be starved out. He spent the day trying to dismantle it, but for every log he moved, 2 more seemed to settle in its place. It was a 2-man job, and he was only 1 man. He returned to the cabin at dusk, covered in mud and sweat, his spirit as dry as the creek bed. Defeat tasted like ash in his mouth. He found Leanne packing a small bundle with the few things she now owned, a spare shirt he'd given her, a small sack of dried apples, and her wooden bird. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice raw. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "I am leaving," she said softly. "This is my fault. That man, Finch, he does this because of me. If I am gone, he will leave you be." "No," Silas said. "He was doing this long before you came. You just gave him a new excuse." "But I made it worse," she insisted, her voice thick with emotion. "I will not be the reason you lose your home. I will not let another person I care for lose everything." She tried to move past him, towards the door. He stepped in her way, blocking her path. For the first time, he reached out and gently took her arm. Her skin was warm, and he could feel a tremor running through her. "Don't go," he said. The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything he couldn't say. "Don't leave me to this silence again. Don't let him win. Stay." She finally looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He will ruin you." "Only if I let him," Silas said, his gaze intense. "He thinks because I'm alone I'm weak. He thinks he can just push me aside." He looked down at her, at this small, fierce woman who had faced down bullies and crossed a continent. "He's wrong. I'm not alone." It was a choice, and they both knew it. For her, the choice to stay and face the danger with him instead of running to save herself. For him, the choice to stand for something more than just a piece of land. He was choosing her. "Stay, Leanne," he said again, his voice softer this time. Stay and help me fight." She searched his face, seeing not pity but partnership. She saw a man who was stubborn and quiet, but who was also decent and strong. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She unfolded her hands and placed the wooden bird on the table, a silent promise. She was home. The fight was just beginning, but for the first time, neither of them would be facing it alone. The next morning, they did not try to dismantle the dam. Instead, with a new resolve, they walked the property together. It was Leanne who noticed it, a slight depression in the land, a line of greener grass that snaked down from the hills. "There was an old spring," Silas explained. "My father told me it dried up a decade ago." "Perhaps it did not dry," Leanne suggested, her eyes scanning the terrain. "Perhaps it just went deeper." For a week they dug. It was back-breaking work, clearing rocks and stubborn roots under the relentless summer sun. Silas used the pickaxe, his muscles straining with each swing, while Leanne shoveled the loosened earth, her small frame surprisingly powerful. They worked from sunrise to sunset, falling into an exhausted sleep each night. But each morning they rose with a renewed sense of purpose. They were a team, their movements falling into a shared rhythm, their silences filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. Finally, Silas's pickaxe struck not rock, but wet, dark soil. A small trickle of water seeped into the ditch they had dug. By evening, it was a steady, clear stream, pooling at the bottom of the trench, before finding its way towards his parched garden and the cattle trough. It wasn't as strong as the creek, but it was theirs. It was enough. When Finch rode by a few days later, expecting to see a defeated man ready to sell, he instead saw a thriving garden, healthy cattle, and a new, deep channel carrying water from the hills. He saw Silas and Leanne working together, reinforcing the banks of their new waterway. He saw not a victim, but an opponent who had refused to break. Without a word, he turned his horse and rode away. He had lost. Their shared determination had been a force he could not dam. 6 months passed. The harshness of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The small homestead was transformed. A sturdy new fence, built post by post, encircled the property. The garden, expanded and meticulously tended by Leanne, yielded a bounty of squash, corn, and beans, enough to last them through the winter. Inside the cabin, bright, simple curtains she had sewn from flour sacks hung in the windows, and the scent of baking bread often filled the small space. It was no longer just his cabin. It was their home. One crisp evening, Silas stood on the porch, watching Leanne feed the chickens. She wore a dress of dark blue wool he had bought for her in town, and sturdy leather boots protected her feet from the cold ground. She was no longer the gaunt, frightened girl from the roadside. Her face had filled out, and her eyes, once filled with exhaustion, now held a quiet, steady light. She finished her task and came to stand beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sun paint the mountains in hues of purple and orange. "Winter'll be here soon," she said softly. "We're ready for it," he replied. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her dark hair. The feelings he'd been holding back, the deep well of affection and respect he felt for her, rose to the surface. "Leanne," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "this place, it wouldn't be anything without you." She turned to him, a small smile on her lips. "And you, Silas, you gave me a place to stand when the whole world was pushing me down." In her hand she held the small carved swallow. She had polished the wood until it shone. He reached out, his calloused hand gently covering hers, his fingers closing over the smooth wood of the bird. "I was just surviving out here," he said, his voice low and earnest. "You taught me how to live again." Her smile widened, reaching her eyes. We taught each other. In that moment, under the vast Wyoming sky, there were no words for what passed between them. It was a promise, a recognition, a quiet certainty that they had both, against all odds, found their way home. The world was still a hard and unforgiving place, but they had built a small, strong shelter, not of wood and stone, but of shared courage and a love as steady and reliable as the water now flowing from the earth. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.